Tēnā koutou o te hāpuri kawa anga pai tua. Greetings and salutations to the ISO, with special thanks to our branch in Pōneke for hosting our illustrious hui ātau. Kia koutou ngā mana, ngā reo, ngā kāhui mau, ngā waihorapa o te Whanganui-a-Tara, whakatau mai rā, i runga i te kaupapa o te wā, a te ōhanga, te pūnaha, te oranga o te rohe whānui o Aotearoa New Zealand. Let us not dither then, we go on to the topic of the hour. The State of the Nation will provide an accounting of the economic situation, an analysis of some of the coalition's policies, examples of resistance, and an accounting of some parts of the geopolitical situation the New Zealand state navigates, the people of Aotearoa New Zealand live in, and some of the particulars involved. This is an attempt at a Marxist analysis of Aotearoa New Zealand as it is today. Such an analysis provides us with a guide to the country's developing situation. This perspective is not intended to be a blueprint of future events. It is not a prophetic or particularly insightful example. The intention is to convey the character of the general underlying processes taking place within New Zealand society so that we in the ISO are not caught out by events. Perspectives take on a heightened importance when the international situation is taken into account. With ever-increasing sharp turns and sudden changes in the trajectory of the world, from defeated coups, mass action and revolutions occurring in the imperial peripheries, all the while crises rack the imperial core. Decisive understanding enables critical analysis. Critical analysis begets proper planning, and proper planning begets effective action. Clear analysis provides a course of approach, a means of preparation through the writhing and ruin of the greatest calamities of our time. Failure to prepare is only preparing to fail, after all. On to the talk. The State of the Nation is a bit fucked. Ka pai. We'll go on to the economic situation. And again, I'd like to thank Comrade McDonough, who sorted this whole thing out. She's one of our friends from Tāmaki Makaurau. The world convulses with ever-escalating crises across a myriad peoples and places. A pitiless bourgeois pursues an ever-shrinking margin of profit, as Comrade Josh pointed out, and neoliberalism, state intervention to create competitive markets, is ossifying into totalitarian market monopolies. Their needs either mediated by state intervention or capitalism maintained by state intervention to expand market competition. The markets themselves rip at covenants and environmental protections to cheapen the access to resources, the great corporate vampires drawing the last drops of blood from a corpse that grows ever colder by the second. Recession. If Tāmaki Makaurau's branch increasing numbers mean anything, it is that we are in a period of sharpened class struggle in New Zealand and real material hardship. According to the Ratonga Whare Paremata Parliamentary Service, September 2024 saw the economy contract for the second consecutive quarter, with GDP falling by 1%, following a revised 1.1% decline in the June 2024 quarter. I don't know what most of this means, but these numbers are somewhat important. Out of the 16 industry groups, 11 experienced a reduction in value-added output, or productive output, whatever, during the September quarter, with the manufacturing and construction sectors leading the GDP decline. The business services sector also notably contributed to the overall economic downturn. On a per capita basis, GDP has fallen for 8 consecutive quarters, with a total decline of 4.8% in quarterly GDP per capita. There has been a 0.7% growth as of the fourth quarter. The situation has been described as crawling out of recession. Certainly, a 0.7% growth after 2 years of decline hardly constitutes an economic recovery. Employment. But what does this 4.1% decline mean in real terms? As the tremors of the Great American Buffalo ripple across the Pacific, the coalition government has overseen a period of inflation, spiking costs of living, and a general sentiment of economic hardship, especially among lowest income households. New Zealand's unemployment rate has increased for 7 straight quarters, reaching 5.1% in the December 2024 quarter. The number of unemployed individuals grew by 5% to 156,000 during this quarter. Employment numbers dropped by 0.1%, driven by a decline in full-time jobs, although part-time employment saw a 0.2% rise. The CTU provides some context. Though the unemployment rate stayed at 5.1%, the number of people working full-time fell by 45,000, while the number working part-time increased by 25,000. Workers are making difficult choices, emerging in the patterns of employment as more and more people are entering a precarious state of work. Tough choices are being made across the width and breadth of the working class. The data demonstrates that 37,000 more people are unemployed than at the last election. Māori unemployment is now at 10.5% and Pacific unemployment is at 10.8%. Based on these numbers of 56,000 unemployed people, over 50% of these are Māori and Pacifica. Unemployment fell in manufacturing, construction, retail, education, and healthcare. Total weekly gross earnings rose by less than inflation at 2.4% annually. 41% of workers saw no pay rise at all. A significant plurality of workers are unable to afford the cost of living in Aotearoa. Youth unemployment continues to rise. There are now 70,700 15 to 24-year-olds unemployed, and 96,600 are not in employment, education, or training. Inflation, wages, and cost of living. Inflation was driven by increases in rents up 3.7%, rates up 12%, household energy up 7.2%. All of these numbers mean stuff. Shit's bad. This is bad. The RNZ offered a guide on how to make your own butter because we're getting brand butter selling at $8.49, up to $10 in some cases. The CTU provides that earlier this year, the minimum wage rose by 1.5%, a full 1% less than actual inflation. This is the second year the government has increased the minimum wage by less than inflation, which means that a full-time minimum wage worker is now cumulatively $2,438 worse off in real terms. Minimum wage workers are missing out on $28.36 a week because of the government's decisions. When he asserts that there is no plan to help these younger, of the CTU, Craig Rennie asserts that there is no plan to help these younger workers and they are bearing the brunt of employment change with rising costs across the board. Students also deal with the myriad of austerity measures that our comrades have fought against with the Students Against Cuts movement, as we saw at our universities. In 2022, of the 38 OECD member countries, New Zealand was 6th in the rankings for unemployment. We are now 18th. So, general vibes from an Ipsos report from April qualifies this information with views from the wider population, or at least whoever they got to do it. 70% of the New Zealand population thinks that businesses making excessive profits are driving inflation. This sentiment has remained constant over the past 4 years, suggesting a perception among New Zealanders around corporate profiteering and its effects on consumer prices. Meanwhile, the proportion of New Zealanders who perceive workers demanding pay increases as a contributing factor has dropped significantly, 46% in April 2025 compared to 53% in May 2024. So that's a give or take 7% drop. This is not necessarily a reflection of increase in class consciousness or that a revolution is right around the corner, but it is indicative of a growing knowledge of cause and effect within the system, especially when we consider the mechanics that were explained in our last talk. Okay, we'll move on to health. Much like the foundations of our economy, there is a sickness that is festered in our health system. It would be dismissive and reductive to ignore the history of our health system and its developments. However, I don't have the expertise or experience to provide a just overview of the issues at hand. However, these statistics are broadly provided in the same vein as our economic overview. The situation is untenable for health workers. The current situation for much of the New Zealand public and their access to healthcare is dire. How is this going to look? No, we're not there yet. In Dunedin, last year, 35,000 or so people protested against funding cuts to the new hospital promised by the previous Labour government. All of the details, of course, I'm sure our Ōtepoti comrades would be able to go into much better to, but after Ministers Shane Reti and Chris Bishop said it would be impossible with the projected budget, we had multiple private companies, in this case, Vital Healthcare Property Trust, offer to cover that cost. The quote from the funding manager, Aaron Hockley, is there'd be a range of contractual projections for the state, and essentially, after they bought out and finished the project, they would be paying us rent. The privatisation offer emerges as the public health system faces a rapidly worsening crisis, including long-term underfunding, lack of staffing and unmet need. In July, the government replaced the Board of Health New Zealand, Te Whatuora, with a commissioner, former private hospital chief executive Lester Levy, who was tasked with making $1.4 million in savings to be achieved largely through what was then 1,600 job cuts. This has jumped to nearly 2,400 as of April this year. The situation in Dunedin and obviously the wider health sector offers a microcosm of the response to the many issues at hand. To describe our health system as simply in a state of crisis would be to imply that it has only just begun. Ultimately, even right-wing pundits like Duncan Gardner are acknowledging decades of hollow platitudes and rising deaths across the country. Waiting lists. Wait times for medical assessment, surgery and other treatments are a nightmare for patients physically, emotionally and financially, broadly increasing in the scope as the Te Whatuora Health New Zealand has broadly been left bereft of historical funding, staffing, political and logistical support, exacerbated by the coalition government's ongoing campaign of funding cuts under the guise of economic prudency. Long wait times for first specialist assessments and treatments have been an issue in New Zealand even before COVID-19 overstretched the health system. In January 2019, over 10,000 New Zealand patients were waiting longer than 4 months for their FSA. COVID-19 added huge pressure. As the country stepped up to its fight against the pandemic, other healthcare services were derailed. Many outpatient appointments and treatments, including elective surgeries, had to be deferred during lockdowns. Diagnostic scans, including MRIs, mammograms, and colonoscopies, were postponed or delayed. The number of patients waiting for more than 4 months for treatment tripled, from over 4,300 in January to 11,900 by January 2019, 2021, tripling. As of January 2025, over 37,000 patients have been waiting more than the target period for their treatment, and over 77,000 patients have been waiting for their, I think FSA is their first sort of standardized assessment. Several long-standing growing concerns, inefficient funding and workforce shortages were aggravated by COVID-19, compounded by burnout and low morale among the country's medical professionals. Chronic underfunding. New Zealand's core health expenditure has lingered below 7% of GDP since at least 2010, while comparable countries are averaging 12%. The political choices behind budget allocation for public health care are not keeping up with demand and inflation. Te Whatuora is requesting that immediate strategies be put in place to manage budget deficits and staffing shortages. These budgetary constraints impact health patient care and how quickly staffing shortages are filled. They also restrict the delay in investments in maintaining and modernising public health facilities, increasing hospital beds and purchasing vital medical equipment. Staffing shortages. Where we have ageing machines and few resources, the New Zealand health system also has an acute shortage of health professionals. Data released by Te Whatuora in July 2023 estimated the shortages at 1,700 doctors, including GPs, 4,800 nurses, 1,050 midwives, 220 oral health practitioners. We don't have the staff. We don't have the numbers. We don't have the people able to do what we need them to do. A member survey by the Association of Salaried Medical Specialists revealed that remuneration, workloads and tight workplace conditions had driven many health professionals to consider opportunities outside the public health system. Some intended to immigrate, while others opted to stay in the country but focus on private practice. This strained staffing situation is expected to worsen over the next decade as healthcare demands increase, lengthening patient wait lists even more. The targeted cuts by the government on health are broadly aligned with the goal of privatisation. On March 7 this year, Simeon Brown delivered a speech to the Business NZ Health Forum that broadly admitted the government is focusing on integrating the private sector into public healthcare. To quote, "I want to see Health New Zealand both lifting its own performance on elective surgeries, but also partnering closely with the private sector to ensure we can get on top of the wait lists and get Kiwis the operations they need as quickly as possible. By partnering with the private sector, we can ensure that people get the care they need, and Health New Zealand can achieve value for money through long-term contracts with the private sector." Something that is reflected in the choices made here by practitioners at a local and individual level due to the structural and targeted demolition of the health sector. Government policy aligning with the private sector and defunding the public sector has ultimately created a financial incentive for more and more practitioners to go private or get out of the country. Aside from contributing to ballooning wait lists, the shortage of GPs and medical specialists also means that some areas don't even have physicians. Doctors aren't there forcing patients and their families to travel up to 100 kilometres just to see a doctor. The health system during and prior to the John Key era suffered from what was popularly named the postcode lottery. This prompted a reform of the district health boards, which operated independently from each other at the time. The level of care differed depending on where patients lived and the state of their local DHB. If their DHB was in debt or their hospitals were full or services unavailable, patients couldn't access care unless they moved to an area with a well-run and well-funded DHB, hence postcode lottery. In April last year, Te Whatuora regions were asked to collectively save $105 million by July using cost containment methods, including banning double shifts, pressure to take leave, non-replacement of sick staff, and wiping unfilled roles. Recruitment was paused on all hospital roles that are not patient-facing and all public health roles that are not community-facing as part of that cost-cutting. Though Te Whatuora claimed this would not affect frontline services, the ongoing consequences are ultimately reflected in the frustrations and low morale within health services. These challenging situations add to the pressure on many healthcare workers. In fact, surveys by ASMS found that work-related burnout remained high among senior medical and dental specialists. In the 2015 and 2020 surveys, 42 and 44% of responders were experiencing work-related burnout. Respondents attribute this to workload pressures, long hours, resource constraints, COVID-19, and frustration with the management and the system. There's also sort of the aging health situation. Demographically, that's somewhat important, but it's really just pointing out that they aren't getting the care they need, and long-term care for age-related chronic conditions and other services in public hospitals is increasing as we get an aging population, adding to everything on top of an already existing underfunded system. We'll get to that. The state of New Zealand's health in 2025 reflects broader structural issues rooted in capitalist mode of production and governance. The sickness has metastasized. The government solution isn't to treat the cancer, but to cut limbs and remove vital organs to save costs and laud efficiencies, as lives are not only lost, but discarded. New viruses are cultured and take root with every budget, every deal, every compromise with power across both governments, across all governments historically that we've had. Additionally, maybe since the 70s. Additionally, the prioritization of digital infrastructure and pharmaceutical spending must be viewed holistically. This is something they've been focusing on due to ongoing crises there, lack of updating machinery, te mea. Though digital infrastructure and pharmaceutical breakthroughs could be celebrated in the context of addressing needs, corporate interests, such as tech and pharma industries, rather than addressing root causes of poor health, such as housing, income, and nutrition, the social determinants of health are ultimately ignored, minimized, or used as talking points for privatization. Overall, the 2025 developments reflect the commodification of healthcare and the reproduction of class-based inequalities under capitalism. On to here. The right-wing wave is crashing upon the rocks as the international working class witnesses the attack against their comrades in the USA. Tariffs spiking, the cost of living, capital accumulation moving as the living standards of workers globally are under attack via austerity, whether under right, centre, or left-wing bourgeois parties. Though pitiless social democrats and market liberals have carried the day in bourgeois elections in Canada and Australia, our own right-wing government maintains a course of economic opportunism. At the international level, there's been a qualitative change in the situation. Such a qualitative change at this level is consequently affecting the situation within Aotearoa New Zealand. Without a doubt, we are witnessing a transformation of capitalist developments not seen since the end of the Second World War, that has been prepared for over this period by the gradual accumulation of contradictions, turning quantity into quality. Harrowing cracks appear in the international order in the wake of ongoing genocide, but also in the complete lack of action in resolving it. Alas, the giant continues to be lulled to sleep, dreamless and aimless as reformists and opportunists demand that action, the anger of the country, the outrage of the masses be channeled into electoral politics. Let us then look at the electoral options. The coalition. The state of the coalition for 2023 to 2025 reflects a continued alignment of the group with, obviously, capitalist class interests, particularly those of the bourgeois, property owners, and large business sectors, financial. After returning to power in the 2023 general election under the politically inept Christopher Luxon, the coalition continues to pursue policies favouring deregulation, tax relief for high-income earners, and all of those things that we know. Measures consistent, obviously, with a neoliberal agenda that reinforces capitalist hegemony, all clouded in selective cultural narratives on the end of the smaller partners. While the National Party lurches to and fro, throwing up curtains of poor word salads or saying little at all. The National Party, acting New Zealand First, represent a consolidation of bourgeois class power through parliamentary means. Elected on the platform of fiscal responsibility and freedom, the coalition's agenda has primarily served the interests of capital by enacting public sector cuts, deregulation, and tax relief targeted towards the property classes. We are aware of this. These policies have disproportionately harmed the working class, obviously through all the mentioned job losses that we're seeing in the economic situation. Erosion of social services and a weakening of labour protections, reinforcing the neoliberal logic that views workers as a cost to be minimised in the service of market efficiency and private profit. Profiteering is the agenda, and they are completely unapologetic about it. The coalition has also engaged in cultural and ideological offensive aimed at dismantling forms of collective resistance and undermining Indigenous sovereignty here in Aotearoa. Act's push for the Treaty Principles Bill, while ultimately defeated in Parliament, symbolised an attempt to reassert settler capitalist dominance over the constitutional status of Te Tiriti Waitangi and to delegitimise Māori political aspirations by framing them as separatist. Meanwhile, the disestablishment of Māori Health Authority right at the start and attacks on co-governance reflect a broader project of reinforcing a unitary state structure that masks the class and colonial contradictions embedded within it. New Zealand First cultural nationalism and Act's libertarianism have worked in tandem to reassert capitalist state authority while deflecting attention from class-based inequality. While the coalition has so far managed to maintain internal cohesion, it remains a fundamentally unstable alliance of capitalist interests with divergent ideological projects. National serves corporate capital. Act champions deregulated individualism while ultimately also serving more corporate capital. The New Zealand First promotes protectionist populism while also serving capital. You could have seen that. This would make an uneasy truce between all of these divergent personalities were not held together, bound together by a shared economic interest in disciplining labour and dismantling regulatory capital constraints. This united front may fray as the 2026 election nears and each party jockeys to assert its distinctive base. However, the economic interests are fundamentally aligned. The coalition exemplifies the capitalist state's adaptability, utilising a blend of economic coercion, racialised narratives, and parliamentary legitimacy to enforce class dominance while maintaining the facade of democratic choice that they like to portray. But I can't emphasise this next point enough. We have to acknowledge that they have done this very effectively. They have leveraged a parliamentary majority with such speed that it largely proves they have the backing of our local bourgeois implicitly. Where Labour's last election cycle was hobbled consistently in their political agendas and watered down much of their policy, the assault on Māori rights, worker rights and disciplined adherence to their agenda has been an utter travesty, but also highlights our general commitment at the Hui Amotu in 2023 that there would be dire consequences to their election, and we were unfortunately vindicated. The unemployment rate has ultimately doubled since 2023 election. It would be remiss to acknowledge the direct connection to the vast layoffs and hiring freeze within the public sector. Ganesh Nana, former commissioner of the now defunct Productivity Commission, and 14 other economists wrote to the Prime Minister and Finance Minister in November, warning their approach risked a long-lasting hollowing out of business. Dare I say it has hollowed out the country. Between 2023 and 2025, New Zealand's National League Coalition has done all this. The policies broadly line up within the implication of class rule, baking the spirit of class domination into the letter of the law. It is as close to explicit as it can get before they start writing in capital rules, laboured rules. Ultimately, all of the above provide some key measures for the future governments to abide by. As we can see here, and these are sort of things, this is a breakdown of what these policies actually mean. The broad aims are to ensure that all new legislation meets criteria from the Regulatory Standards Bill, minimal interference in individual liberty, and market-consistent regulation. This is from the ACT playbook. This is their wording. This is how they're justifying corporate domination. It would privilege capitalist property rights and market logic over redistributive or protective regulations that could benefit workers. It restricts the scope of democratic governments to, bourgeois democratic governments to enact interventions that might challenge the accumulation of capital, such as environmental protections, rent controls, or workplace safety reforms by framing them as inefficient or regulatory overreach. There we go. It's institutionalizing neoliberalism. The coalition's legislation is part of a broader ideological project to entrench neoliberal values within the state's legal architecture. By hardwiring pro-market assumptions into the regulatory process, the bill limits future governments' ability to pursue policies that might redistribute power or resources toward, well, I guess not really the working class, but at least unions, thereby reinforcing existing class structures. Shifting the state's role. Traditionally, the state under capitalism has been a means of mediating between capital and labour to maintain its legitimacy. It portrays a facade of independence between capital and the people, ultimately navigating those two. The legislation largely weakens any pretense of mediation by promoting a regulatory minimalism that disproportionately favours business interests, locating power and to sign off on these in the hands of particular ministers, almost formalising the process of who to bribe. This transforms the state further into a manager of capital's long-term interests, but also enables its short-term pillaging. It entrenches this dynamic to such a degree as to effectively remove any facade of institutional neutrality. By requiring all new laws to pass a test of regulatory reasonableness grounded in economic liberalism, the bills and acts deter radical or redistributive legislation. It creates a structural bias against laws that seek to challenge capitalist relations, such as union protections, living wage mandates, or stronger tenant rights, on the basis that they introduce unjustifiable burdens on businesses. Environmentalism, Māori rights, gender, age, and disability are all ultimately at the mercy of economic liberalism. Historically, this bodes ill for us all. The above offers examples of the intensified efforts to discipline labour through restrictions on union power and a rollback of progressive industrial reforms introduced by the previous Labour government. The party's rhetoric of fiscal responsibility masked the deepening of class stratification as working class and marginalised communities bore the brunt of austerity measures. The coalition, despite the unabashed dismissal Luxon's partners have for him, functions as the political expression of the capitalist class, managing the state's apparatus to secure the conditions for capital accumulation while undermining proletarian interests. And despite such a massive attack on the working class, are still polled to potentially win a second election come March at 63 seats rather than 67. They have currently, according to an RNZ research poll in March, the coalition serves as a tool for class entrenchment. In the vein of the Treaty Principles Bill, the coalition offers a stolid, determined codification of capitalist hegemony into law, insulating capital from future bourgeois democratic or working class challenges at the electoral and legislative level, shackling any legal resistance within the bureaucracy or judiciary. The terms and conditions of society are being rewritten. What do our heroes in Parliament have to say on the matter? Parliamentary opposition. The New Zealand opposition parties from 2023 to 2025, principally the Labour Party, Te Pāti Māori and the Greens, largely continue to function within the bounds of bourgeois parliamentary politics, offering limited systemic challenge to capitalist hegemony despite rhetorical opposition and promises, talking to radicalism. Following its defeat in the 2023 general election, the Labour Party entered a period of internal reassessment and leadership transition with little evidence of a substantive leftward shift in strategy. Despite criticisms of the fast-track approvals bill, despite warnings that ultimately these things eroding democratic checks and balances, as we've seen ultimately with multiple responses, and for example, DOC, the covenants they have with Māori communities, those ultimately being ripped away. The pay equity amendment bill coming through that they have criticised, Jane Tinetti saying National has forced through a law change that will take money out of women's pockets, further criticising the process, noting that the legislation was rushed through urgency without proper consultation. The accusation of sacrificing equal pay for women in order to balance the budget made by Chris Hipkins. Duncan Webb on the regulatory standards bill. Under the guise that is simply seeks to streamline regulatory process and improve efficiency and transparency. It is seeking to do two radical things. First, place constraints on the power of the government to intervene in the affairs of citizens. Second, orient regulation making to prioritise property rights and individual freedoms. Ultimately, its aim is to roll back the state. It's important to recognise that when Labour summons forth the ghost of radicalism, railing against austerity measures and underfunding, they remain focused on technocratic common sense, governance rather than structural transformation, reinforcing its role as a party of social liberal compromise rather than any hope of channeling class struggle. They can raise all of these criticisms, they can talk to the issues, but they can never offer a solid solution. Te Pāti Māori has intensified its advocacy for tino rangatiratanga and decolonial practice with initiatives that increasingly do intersect with class politics, particularly as Māori communities disproportionately face precarity and labour exploitation. Obviously, in March 2024, the party issued Te Ngākau o Te Iwi Māori, a declaration of political independence, proposing the establishment of a Māori parliament grounded in tika rankawa, something that we did talk about in our hui ato in 2024. The argument here is no longer can we allow this very House, Parliament, to dictate our rangatiratanga. A pivotal moment, obviously, that captured the public imagination was in November when Te Pāti Māori MPs Rawiri Waititi, Debbie Ngarewa-Paka and Hana Rafti Maipi-Clark performed a haka in Parliament with Labour MP Penny Henare to protest the Treaty Principles Bill, which sought to redefine the Treaty of Waitangi. This act of defiance led to their suspension, marking the harshest disciplinary action in New Zealand's parliamentary history. Though the bill was ultimately defeated in 2025, following both widespread public opposition, but the coalition never promised to pass it anyway. It was ultimately the largest protest on Māori rights in the nation's history and one of the largest protests in New Zealand history. I think the largest. Te Pāti's effectiveness in challenging the material conditions of Māori workers depends on their ability to forge solidarity with broader anti-capitalist movements. Though Te Pāti Māori emerges a more radical opposition voice in comparison to Labour, not very difficult, particularly in response to the coalition government's attacks on Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the dismantling of Māori institutions such as Te Aka Whaiora, Te Pāti Māori's resistance could signal a potential convergence between Indigenous self-determination and class politics. However, the lack of coherent program on class questions or coherent analysis on the question of the settled state raises many concerns of its delivery of radical policy, let alone radical social transformation. Like Labour, despite rejecting Parliament as a legitimate force, they ultimately cling to parliamentary electoralism they claim to reject, while also pushing for voters to vote rather than any street-level protest mobilisations, aside from the occasional haka on Parliament steps. Though we do have to kind of acknowledge that the challenging of parliamentary processes themselves, they're really the only ones to do it, regardless of how performative that is. The Greens continue to articulate a progressive agenda on climate change, social welfare and equality, often highlighting the ecological costs of the coalition's deregulatory agenda. Despite party co-leader Chloe Swarbrick's declaration of pushing a grassroots community-focused advocacy for policies such as wealth taxes and green investment, the Greens are insufficiently confrontational towards capital accumulation. Though there have been a menagerie of issues that face the Greens over the past 2 years, including scandals from multiple sitting MPs, there is a general commitment emerging to widen the voter base outside of a few progressive suburbs. The Greens are one of the more transparent parties that largely attempt to stick to their principles. Their budgets, laudable in the sweeping benefits many of the poorer of our society and directly attacking the wealthy through a populist private jet tax, remains constrained by their orientation towards legislative reform within the capitalist state rather than mobilising mass working class resistance, largely moving in the same current as Labour. They want to reform the system, but they will not break it. Though there are MPs and candidates that may potentially have the stomach for more radical action, especially looking at Chloe Swarbrick's attendance at a variety of rallies on topics from Palestine to occupations in the far north, currently ongoing at Waipiro, we cannot ignore that their green budget slogan seems to echo our own as if in a distorted mirror. A better world is possible. Let us show you how. Though I think a vanguard party, the Greens are not. Here we get to some of the politics of opposition. Here are some notable moments that are sort of pitched from after our hui to over into here just before it this year. Over the last year, from June into 2025, Aotearoa New Zealand has seen a wave of mass mobilisations that should be recognised as grassroots expressions of community self-organisation. Naturally, we see them here as an expression of discontent across many parts of the community, the nerves and tendons of the giant I mentioned earlier. Many are organised attempts of resistance to the intensification of capitalist and state power, especially when we consider the growth and occupation movements in Te Ao Māori that are occurring over this past year. The convergence of protests against the Treaty Principles Bill, for Palestinian solidarity and defence of environmental protections, and also preemptive action against corporate exploitation. Unions and workers provide opposition to attacks on labour rights, like the Pay Equity Amendment Act, which broadly reflects a growing popular backlash against these policies that serve ruling class interests that are ultimately undermining Māori sovereignty, ecological integrity, and working class livelihoods. The massive hikoi I mentioned earlier and rallies led by Māori communities against the Treaty Principles Bill represented not only a defence of tino rangatiratanga, but a potential to offer a broader challenge to the bourgeois state's attempt to redefine foundational social contracts with and against Indigenous communities in service of neoliberal revisionism. Likewise, resistance to the fast-track law and rollback of pay equity provisions again highlights how the capitalist state obviously is prioritising extraction and profit over worker security and environmental stewardship. People are rejecting this. People are upset. People are responding to it. They underscore a period of heightened civic engagement in New Zealand, reflecting widespread public's concern over these issues. People recognise that the situation isn't good. They're actively working against the government and its program. These struggles, though often fragmented along cultural, environmental and labour lines, illustrate an opportunity for multi-sectoral front, as was brought up. It is the attack broadly hitting everyone. People are responding to it. But importantly, these movements also expose the absence of a unified revolutionary program capable of confronting the systemic roots of oppression in Aotearoa. All the potential is there, but there's no ideological direction. There's no theory direction. There's no clear link to all of these. People are recognizing capitalism is an issue, but they're being distracted by the current days. Doesn't help that every time there's a protest, Green, Labour, Te Pāti Māori will show up and say, vote us in next election, we'll repeal the policies, we'll take it back. Take it back to what? Already seeing the issues there. So, a conclusion, hope against all odds, the struggle goes on. Difficult to do that, admittedly. While elements within the opposition in Parliament and on the streets express dissent against the ruling bloc, they largely operate within a framework that seeks to humanise capitalism, argue for a more robust and rational series of checks and balances rather than overthrow it. They reflect the broader limitations of electoral politics in delivering class emancipation and the lack of cohesive revolutionary spine across the diverse body of the working class of Aotearoa. Demands for workers and the wider public to vote themselves out of the situation and repeal the government's policies ring hollow in the wake of absolute domination of the bureaucratic legislative process by the coalition. Though there are leaks, brave people in the public service resist in their own small revolts, but there will be no victory in the actions of the view. The unions prevaricate. The economy is shaken and will not be recovering anytime soon. Radical politics will do well in this time. However, that goes as much to reactionary forces as it does to progressive communists. The house system is a zombie. Its coffin is being prepared and the nails are digging in. The coalition standing, scythe out and ready to reap what they have sown and usher in a privatised health system on a road of dead, scarred and dying. The workers involved are aware of this precarious unlife, barely keeping the organs functioning as some flee and many break under the pressures. I can only salute as they work into the dark night. Despite clear tensions in the personalities, or lack thereof in some cases, of the coalition heads, barring a significant crisis beyond that caused by their policies, a significant upswell in self-directed worker resistance, an unprecedented crisis that shakes the foundations of the state, the coalition is likely to hold together into the 2026 elections, and they may indeed carry them. The opposition refuses to organise anything other than token rhetoric and appeals for votes. Yes, the attack on Māori, the ongoing culture wars peddled by ACT and New Zealand First and National, The chaotic dynamic between the three-headed ogre hasn't been choking us slowly. It has hidden every strike behind another, towing the line between political theatre and ruthless parliamentary expediency. We may be in the night. Our strength fails us and there is no cohesion in the lines. Genocide occurs in Gaza, fascism descends in Washington, Beijing and Moscow loom large in the shadows. Harsh, cold winter blows onto our shores. Yes, e te minanga, who am I to claim otherwise? The truth, the hardest, coldest truth, that shit is not going well. The people live under the same tyrant vice, this cruel fist that cracks down on us every day. We are shackled, comrades. We are shackled. Yet still, though the night is long and the dark is harrowing, we will not be kept warm by the smouldering ashes of tradition draped over cold stone halls of the capitalist fortress. Our agency is snatched away, not by a foreign king or a distant governor, not by the boards of the conglomerate Fonterras or any of the big four. Inaction guarantees defeat, for surrender is the end of struggle. He hate nei mea o hātana, this great act of expropriation, the mass enslavement of the minds and souls of our people. Capitalism is a ngārara in the pits of our stomachs and the notches of our throats. From the pollution of the earth, sea and skies, to the corruption and commodification of our spirits and bodies. But we cannot forget. In short, communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. In all of these movements, we bring to the front, as a leading question in each, the property question, no matter what its degree of development at the time. There'll be times when the struggle seems impossible, where labour everywhere is subordinate to the whims of capital, to the seduction of reformism, bowed by baton and bullet, the fetters of a life built on the backs of the enslaved across the world. There is a growing consciousness of the working body in Aotearoa, its sinews and muscles materialising in occupied minds and anti-genocide marches, as it blinks blearily as if awakening to itself for the first time in a very long time. There's a sleeping giant across the width and breadth of our islands, across the oceans and beyond. Communists have no desire to conceal our views and aims. We openly declare that our ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. These moments of defiance will down the walls, a chip at a time, a brick here, mortar there, until a world united batters down these walls. Every crack will echo into the night, and with it will come a dawn of our own making. Comrades, the proletarians have nothing to lose but our chains. The giant must awake. We have a world to win. Tēnā koutou katoa.